Believing in God is the surest way to never encounter Him. This statement might sound like radical atheism, but it actually represents one of Carl Jung's most profound insights about the nature of authentic spirituality. Tonight, we continue our exploration of Jung's revolutionary psychology by examining what he considered the greatest misunderstanding about religion: the confusion of psychological experience with intellectual belief. Building on our previous discussions of the shadow, projection, the curse of consciousness, the anima, prophetic dreams, the inflated ego, collective psychology, and the pursuit of happiness, we now turn to Jung's radical reframing of spiritual life. What happens when we mistake intellectual assent to doctrines for genuine religious experience? What are the psychological consequences of treating divine realities as external objects rather than inner living processes? By the end of our journey, you'll understand why Jung considered both fundamentalist believers and committed atheists to be making essentially the same error. And more importantly, you'll discover his revolutionary perspective on spirituality as psychological process rather than belief system, an approach that transforms religion from abstract theology into direct lived experience. The great misunderstanding: confusing belief with experience. Religion is a defense against the experience of God. This provocative statement captures the essence of what Jung considered the fundamental misunderstanding about spiritual life: the confusion of intellectual belief with direct psychological experience. To understand this distinction, we must first recognize Jung's unique approach to religious questions. Unlike both traditional theologians and secular critics, Jung approached religion neither as a system of metaphysical truths to be accepted or rejected, nor as mere cultural artifacts to be studied objectively. He approached religious phenomena as a psychologist, investigating their function and meaning in human psychological life, regardless of their ultimate metaphysical status. This psychological approach led him to a revolutionary insight. What matters in religious life is not what you believe about ultimate reality, but how you experience and relate to the psychic forces that religious symbols represent. Religious doctrines, rituals, and narratives aren't primarily intellectual propositions about external realities, but symbolic expressions of psychological processes that can be directly experienced. As Jung wrote in Psychology and Religion, "Among all my patients in the second half of life, there has not been one whose problem in the last resort was not that of finding a religious outlook on life. It is safe to say that every one of them fell ill because he had lost what the living religions of every age have given to their followers. And none of them has been really healed who did not regain his religious outlook." But crucially, this religious outlook has nothing to do with accepting specific theological doctrines or supernatural claims. It refers to what Jung called religious experience, direct psychological encounters with forces greater than the conscious ego, whether these are conceptualized as God, the unconscious, the self, or by other terms. This distinction between belief and experience illuminates why Jung made the shocking claim that believing in God is the surest way to never encounter Him. When religion is reduced to intellectual assent to doctrines about an external deity, it actually insulates the believer from the psychological reality those doctrines symbolically represent. The believer relates to concepts about God rather than experiencing directly the psychological reality those concepts point toward. Consider how many religious believers hold abstract theological positions while showing little evidence of psychological transformation. They may passionately defend doctrines about divine love while displaying minimal compassion in their relationships. They may proclaim belief in divine wisdom while exhibiting rigid black and white thinking. They may insist on divine judgment while lacking genuine moral discernment. The gap between intellectual belief and lived experience reveals that something essential has been missed. As Jung observed in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, "I do not believe, I know." This cryptic statement distinguishes intellectual belief from direct psychological knowing. Jung wasn't claiming supernatural knowledge, but pointing to the difference between accepting second-hand doctrines and directly experiencing the psychological realities those doctrines symbolically represent. This insight explains Jung's puzzling assertion that dogmatic believers and committed atheists often make the same fundamental error. Both treat God primarily as an external object rather than an inner psychological reality. The believer affirms this external object's existence. The atheist denies it. But both miss that God might better be understood as representing a psychological process or experience rather than an external entity to be intellectually affirmed or rejected. In our next section, we'll explore Jung's understanding of religion as symbolic expression of psychological realities, and how this perspective transforms spiritual life from intellectual assent to living experience. But first, consider this question. How has the distinction between intellectual belief and direct experience manifested in your own spiritual life? Have you noticed times when beliefs about ultimate reality have substituted for direct engagement with the psychological forces those beliefs symbolically represent? God as psychic reality, religion as living symbol. If religious concepts aren't primarily intellectual propositions about external realities, what are they? Jung proposed that religious symbols, narratives, and doctrines represent symbolic expressions of psychological processes, particularly the relationship between the conscious ego and the much larger unconscious psyche. From this perspective, God isn't primarily an external supernatural entity, but a symbol for what Jung called the self, the organizing center and totality of the psyche that transcends and includes the conscious ego. Divine attributes throughout religious traditions: omniscience, omnipresence, creative power, judgment and mercy, transcendence and immanence, symbolically represent aspects of this larger psychic reality and its relationship to ego consciousness. As Jung wrote in Psychology and Religion, among the so-called neurotics of our day, there are a good many who in other ages would not have been neurotic, that is, divided against themselves. If they had lived in a period and in a milieu in which man was still linked by myth with the world of the ancestors, and thus with nature truly experienced and not merely seen from outside, they would have been spared this division within themselves. This perspective doesn't reduce religion to psychology in a reductive sense that denies transcendent dimensions. Rather, it expands psychology to include precisely the transcendent elements that religious traditions have always recognized. Jung didn't claim that God is nothing but a psychological projection. He proposed that whatever ultimate reality might be, it is known through psychological processes that religious symbols accurately represent. Consider the Christian conception of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. From Jung's perspective, this isn't merely an abstract theological doctrine about the nature of an external deity. It symbolically represents the dynamic relationship between different aspects of the psyche. The transcendent ground of being, Father, its incarnation in individual human consciousness, Son, and the transformative connection between them, Holy Spirit. Similarly, religious narratives of death and resurrection, from Jesus' crucifixion to the dismemberment of Osiris to the phoenix rising from ashes, aren't merely stories about external events, but symbolic representations of psychological transformation processes. They depict the necessary death of limited identity structures and the emergence of renewed consciousness through encounter with the deeper dimensions of the psyche. This symbolic understanding doesn't invalidate traditional religious perspectives. It offers a psychological framework that gives them living meaning rather than reducing them to abstract propositions requiring blind acceptance. As Jung noted in Psychological Types, the greatness and liberating effect of all genuine, deeply experienced religious and philosophical matters lies precisely in the fact that they are only the symbols or expressions of a much wider and more complex relationship which cannot be expressed in any other way. For Jung, religious symbols aren't arbitrary cultural constructions, but accurate representations of psychological realities that have been consistently experienced across cultures and historical periods. The remarkable similarities between religious motifs in cultures that never had contact, from mandala patterns to hero journeys, from divine child symbols to sacred marriage motifs, suggest they emerge from common psychological structures of the human psyche rather than mere historical accident. This understanding transforms how we might approach religious traditions. Instead of asking, are these doctrines factually true statements about external reality? We might ask, what psychological realities do these symbols represent? And how can I experience those realities directly in my own life? In our next section, we'll explore how Jung's approach transforms spiritual practice from efforts to strengthen belief into methods for direct psychological experience. But first, consider this question. How might your relationship with religious or spiritual traditions change if you approach their symbols and narratives primarily as representations of psychological processes, rather than as propositions requiring Intellectual assent or rejection? Beyond belief. The path of direct experience. If authentic spirituality isn't primarily about believing doctrines, but experiencing psychological realities, how might we approach spiritual life differently? Jung's work suggests several specific approaches that transform religion from abstract theology into direct lived experience. First, Jung emphasized the importance of symbolic thinking as distinct from both literal and allegorical interpretations of religious material. Literal interpretation treats religious symbols as factual statements about external reality, missing their psychological significance. Allegorical interpretation reduces symbols to mere illustrations of abstract concepts, draining them of emotional power. Symbolic understanding recognizes that religious symbols express realities that cannot be adequately captured through conceptual thinking alone. As Jung wrote in Psychological Types, a symbol is not an allegory and not a sign, but an image of a content that largely transcends consciousness. Developing symbolic thinking involves approaching religious content with the question not, is this factually true? Or, what concept does this illustrate? But, what experience does this symbol evoke and make accessible? Practice this approach by engaging with religious symbols, narratives, or rituals from your own tradition or others that resonate with you. Rather than analyzing their historical origins or theological implications, pay attention to your psychological response. What emotions, intuitions, or inner shifts do they evoke? This direct psychological engagement often reveals depths of meaning that intellectual analysis misses. Second, Jung emphasized the importance of dream work as a path to direct encounter with the unconscious dimensions that religious symbols represent. Dreams provide direct communication from the deeper psyche, often using the same archetypal patterns and symbolic language found in religious traditions. As Jung noted in Man and His Symbols, dreams are the direct expression of unconscious psychic activity. Working with dreams involves not merely analyzing their content intellectually, but engaging with their symbolic communication experientially. This might involve active imagination with dream images, artistic expression of dream content, or dialogue with dream figures as representatives of unconscious aspects of the psyche. Third, Jung emphasized what he called active imagination, a method of conscious engagement with unconscious content that creates direct psychological experience beyond intellectual reflection. Unlike passive fantasy or directed visualization, active imagination involves establishing conscious relationship with autonomous psychic content while maintaining awareness of the process. Practice this approach by starting with a compelling religious symbol, image, or narrative. Allow it to develop autonomously in your imagination without intellectually directing it, while maintaining conscious awareness of the process. Journal, create art, or engage in inner dialogue with the emerging content, treating it as an authentic communication from deeper levels of the psyche rather than mere fantasy. Fourth, Jung recognized the value of religious ritual when approached as symbolic enactment rather than magical procedure or empty formality. Ritual creates conditions for direct psychological experience through embodied participation in symbolic actions that engage multiple levels of consciousness simultaneously. As Jung wrote in Psychology and Religion, ritual is an attempt to bridge the gulf between the conscious mind and the unconscious. When approached with symbolic understanding rather than literal belief or mere social conformity, traditional religious rituals can facilitate precisely the direct encounter with psychological depth that abstract theology often misses. Fifth, Jung emphasized the importance of what he called the religious attitude, an orientation of receptivity, humility, and attentiveness to psychological dimensions beyond the conscious ego. This attitude doesn't depend on specific theological beliefs, but creates openness to direct experience of the psychological realities that religious symbols represent. Develop this attitude by practicing regular attention to synchronicities, meaningful coincidences, maintaining receptivity to dreams and intuitions, cultivating genuine curiosity about psychological depths beyond your conscious understanding, and approaching life's challenges as potentially meaningful communications, rather than mere obstacles to overcome. Finally, Jung emphasized the integration of religious understanding with ordinary life, rather than its separation into distinct spiritual domain. Authentic spiritual development isn't about transcending ordinary experience, but deepening engagement with it through recognition of its psychological and symbolic dimensions. As Jung wrote in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, the gods have become diseases. Zeus no longer rules Olympus, but rather the solar plexus, and produces curious specimens for the doctor's consulting room. This striking statement suggests that the mythic forces once projected onto external deities now manifest as psychological dynamics requiring integration rather than mere intellectual belief or rejection. These approaches share a common orientation. They transform religion from intellectual positions about external realities into methods for direct psychological experience. They don't require acceptance or rejection of specific theological doctrines. They invite engagement with the living psychological realities that religious traditions have always symbolically represented. The paradox of faith, knowledge beyond belief. We began with a provocative statement. Believing in God is the surest way to never encounter Him. We've explored Jung's understanding of religion as symbolic expression of psychological realities, and how this perspective transforms spiritual life from intellectual assent to living experience. Now, we arrive at his most challenging insight, the paradoxical nature of authentic faith as distinct from mere belief. For Jung, genuine faith isn't intellectual acceptance of unprovable propositions. It's direct psychological knowing that transcends the limitations of both belief and doubt. As he cryptically stated in a BBC interview when asked if he believed in God, "I don't believe, I know." This statement points to the crucial distinction between intellectual positions about ultimate reality and direct psychological experience of the realities those positions attempt to describe. This perspective illuminates Jung's provocative claim that dogmatic believers and committed atheists often make the same fundamental error. Both treat religious realities primarily as intellectual propositions about external objects, rather than as symbolic representations of psychological processes that can be directly experienced. The fundamentalist insists on literal acceptance of religious doctrines, missing their symbolic significance and psychological reality. The atheist rejects these same doctrines on rational grounds, similarly missing their value as symbolic expressions of psychological truths. Both approaches focus on the map, conceptual formulations, rather than the territory, direct psychological experience, that religious symbols imperfectly represent. As Jung wrote in Psychology and Religion, the idea of God is an absolutely necessary psychological function of an irrational nature, which has nothing whatever to do with a question of God's existence. The human intellect can never answer this question, still less give any proof of God's existence. Moreover, such proof is superfluous, for the idea of an all-powerful divine being is present everywhere, unconsciously if not consciously, because it is an archetype. This perspective doesn't invalidate either religious or scientific worldviews. It suggests that both can be approached either as intellectual systems requiring belief or as methods for direct engagement with reality. The religious person who directly experiences the psychological realities their tradition symbolically represents has more in common with the scientist who directly investigates natural phenomena than with the religious person who merely accepts doctrines without experience. Jung's approach offers resolution to the apparent conflict between scientific and religious worldviews by recognizing their different domains of concern. Science investigates the causal relationships between physical phenomena. Religion, properly understood, explores the meaning and purpose dimensions of human experience. These aren't competing explanations of the same domain, but complementary approaches to different aspects of reality. As Jung noted in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, science is the tool of the Western mind, and with it, more doors can be opened than with bare hands. It is part and parcel of our understanding and obscures our insight only when it holds that the understanding of parts is the same as the understanding of the whole. This integrative perspective creates possibility for what might be called psychological faith. Neither blind acceptance of doctrines nor cynical rejection of all religious dimensions, but direct engagement with the psychological realities that religious traditions symbolically represent. Consider Michael, an educated professional who had rejected his childhood religious tradition as intellectually untenable, yet felt persistent emptiness despite material success and intellectual stimulation. Through engaging with dreams, synchronicities, and creative expression, he began directly experiencing psychological depths beyond his conscious identity, precisely the dimensions that religious symbols represent. This didn't lead him back to literal belief in religious doctrines, but to recognition of their value as symbolic expressions of psychological realities he was now directly experiencing. The religious narratives he had rejected as literal propositions took on new significance as symbolic representations of his own psychological journey. The God he had rejected as an external supernatural entity revealed itself as a symbol for the organizing center of his own psyche that transcended his conscious ego. As Jung wrote in answer to Job, "It is only through the psyche that we can establish that God acts upon us, but we are unable to distinguish whether these actions emanate from God or from the unconscious. We cannot tell whether God and the unconscious are two different entities. Both are borderline concepts for transcendental contents. But empirically, it can be established with a sufficient degree of probability that there is in the unconscious an archetype of wholeness which manifests itself spontaneously in dreams, etc., and a tendency, independent of the conscious will, to relate other archetypes to this center. This psychological approach to spirituality doesn't claim to resolve ultimate metaphysical questions about divine existence. It offers a middle path between dogmatic belief and dogmatic skepticism, direct engagement with the psychological realities that religious symbols represent, without requiring either acceptance or rejection of specific theological positions about their ultimate nature or origin. As you reflect on tonight's exploration of Jung's perspective on religion and spirituality, consider this question. How might your relationship with religious or spiritual dimensions change if you focused less on what you believe or don't believe about ultimate reality, and more on directly experiencing the psychological processes that religious symbols represent? What might open up in your life if you approached spiritual questions not as intellectual propositions requiring assent or rejection, but as invitations to direct psychological experience beyond the limitations of your conscious ego? Remember Jung's core insight. The greatest misunderstanding about spirituality is confusing intellectual belief with direct psychological experience. Whether you consider yourself religious, spiritual, but not religious, agnostic, or atheist, the invitation remains the same: to engage directly with the psychological depths that religious traditions have always symbolically represented, beyond the limitations of both dogmatic belief and dogmatic skepticism. In a world increasingly divided between fundamentalist religious certainty and militant secular rejection, Jung's perspective offers an unexpected third path. Not intellectual compromise between competing belief systems, but direct psychological engagement with the living realities that all conceptual systems ultimately attempt to describe. Not believing in God or denying God, but experiencing directly the psychological reality that this most persistent of human symbols has always represented. What might emerge in your own life if you moved beyond the question of what you believe about ultimate reality and engaged directly with the psychological depths that religious symbols have always pointed toward? And how might this engagement transform not just your intellectual positions about spiritual questions, but your lived experience of the mystery at the heart of human existence?